Let's get started. We have a large group connected already and a great agenda for this session. So let's begin. My name is Oscar Calvo. I'm one of the directors at the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank, and I will be your moderator for this session. A very warm welcome to this Global 2021 event on innovating evaluation in multilateral and bilateral agencies, dealing with operational challenges during the COVID-19 crisis. For most of us, the last 15 months have been like no other in our professional lives. We've had to change in ways big and small, done our best to overcome challenges, and perhaps even stumbled into some unexpected good things that we may want to continue in the future. To share their experiences, what innovations have been developed or perhaps simply just scaled up, and reflect on what the new normal may look like, we have a terrific panel of practitioners, which I will introduce in a minute, from DeVal, USAID, and IEG. But before we give the floor to the panel, I wanted to invite Alison Evans, Director General Evaluation at the World Bank, to kick us off with some introductory remarks. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you so much, Oscar, and it is a genuine pleasure to be participating in one of the many, I think 350 events taking place across this Global Week in 2021, but particularly to have this opportunity to offer some opening remarks for what promises, I think, to be a really fascinating event on innovating evaluation in multilateral and bilateral agencies. And I want to thank you in advance to all the panelists for taking the time to join us today. So this year's theme for Global, Building Forward Better, I think nicely frames the reason why we're focusing on innovation today. The COVID pandemic has upended nearly every aspect of life, and as a consequence, it has ushered in a significant amount of reflection and some self-critique on the ways we work and how we go about our professional practice. Going back to an old normal now seems not only infeasible, but also undesirable. So how is the pandemic causing us to reflect and rethink? I think the first thing is it's forcing us to examine how we evaluate in times of complexity and increased uncertainty, and how we take account of the intersecting challenges that are increasingly defining the development space, from climate, conflict and COVID to health, environment and livelihoods. The second is that COVID is exposing fault lines, deep inequalities in our economies and societies that require us to question some of the assumptions and stylized facts that exist about what works, how and for whom. But also, I think, to give serious reflection to the value of different sources of knowledge and understanding, to local evidence systems and local expertise, as well as to the importance of doing no harm. Thirdly, the speed with which things are evolving and changing is putting us all under pressure to do more and to do more quickly, and to find ways to more effectively bridge looking back and looking forward. Arguably, this is not evaluation's natural habitat, but one that we've really had to adapt to over the past year and a half. So how does innovation fit in? Well, I think the first thing to say is that innovation may be one of those terms that we overuse in our rhetoric and underdeliver in our practice. And I think one possible reason for that is we associate innovation very often with invention, of doing something entirely new. But in fact, a lot of useful innovation is about doing existing things and applying them in new ways or new contexts, or taking techniques from one part of our practice and applying them to another. And I think a good example of that is the increasing use of AI techniques in different areas of evaluation. Another possible reason for why we seem to innovate less than we think we should is that in the face of uncertainty, there is a temptation for institutions and particularly for bureaucracies to hunker down, to stick to what they know, often fed by a culture of risk aversion and fear of making mistakes. I think what is clear, though, is that to support innovation as a way of riding out a crisis, we need to create the right institutional environment for it. An important part of that is building an environment of open-mindedness and trust. So what are some of the domains in which innovation has and can happen in evaluation? Well, the first and probably most obvious area is around data. Data is at a premium in a crisis. And it is at times like this where we find out where we have too little data and where we have more than we can handle. And there are innovations we can deploy, from reusing or recycling data to address those questions we're frequently asked as evaluators, or using new publicly available data sets such as sentiment surveys and social media data to enhance conventional data sources, or reaching out across disciplines is another useful technique. So, for example, Earth observation data, once the preserve of geographers and climatologists for predictive use, is increasingly valuable to evaluators. Another area of innovation is the deployment of analytical techniques, and I'm sure we're going to hear lots of that from the panel, so I'll skip over that area. But there's another interesting angle to innovation, which is coming up with different communication and learning models better suited to fast-moving crises. In a way, the time to sit in a workshop for 1 or 2 days to absorb information is really not available to us right now. Audiences are both remote, but sometimes also more accessible via technology. So another thing, certainly we've been reflecting on in IAG, is how we can create salient, accessible learning insights from our evaluations that meet the time pressures and audience-specific needs of a fast-moving pandemic. More broadly, for evaluation to work well during these challenging times, it's important that it's not simply seen as a blunt instrument defined by a narrow bar or threshold of success or failure, but instead it's using evaluation to help create the conditions for using evidence to guide what to do, what to continue, what to scale, what to stop doing. In this approach, we take our innovative mindset to broaden the concept of accountability to feature not only direct accountability for results, which remains super important, but also accountability for using evidence and learning as inputs to adaptive decision-making and problem-solving. Accountability becomes part of how things get done, not just what gets done. And we probably, like many, are trying to bring this particular mindset to how we assess the World Bank's early stage response to COVID. We're relying on well-worn techniques and applying new techniques to some of those well-worn problems. We're introducing a modular approach to provide feedback as we go. But overall, we're trying to adopt an open mindset to what might be needed to generate robust and useful evidence to support future stages of the COVID response. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. So right back to you, Oscar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Let me now tell you a bit about the panel. We'll have 3 presentations of 3 large evaluation groups working in international development. Each of them, DeVal, USAID, and IAG, has a different institutional and evaluation model, and each speaker will start by sharing a bit about their respective evaluation approach. Now, one thing they all have in common is their interest in evaluation innovations, and they each will speak on that too. Our first speaker is Sven Harten, Deputy Director of the Competence Center for Evaluation Methodology at the German Institute for Development Evaluation. And in addition to the work associated naturally with this title, he is an expert on evaluation capacity development. Now, before I give the floor to Sven, a word on logistics. We hope to have presentations for a combined total of about 45 minutes, starting with Eval, then followed by USAID, then IEG. And then we will have a discussion for about 20 minutes or so, Q&A. And for that, we ask that you use Poll Everywhere. This is the link that you're seeing on the screen now, pollev.com/IEG now. And we ask that you actually check that on either a separate device or a separate browser. And we will be asking for your inputs for the Q&A through that means. Now, in fact, to familiarize ourselves with the mechanics, let's try this. I want you to go and submit an answer to a first question that will also give us a sense of who is in the virtual room today. So if you can go to pollev.com/IG now in a separate browser or in a separate device, and you should be able to see the question, how do you spend most of your time related to evaluation? And hopefully we will be getting answers to those questions soon. Maybe we can return to that at the end of the session. All right, so let me give the floor straight away to Sven from the Val.
Thank
Sven,
you. Thank you, Oscar, also for your kind introduction, and thank you, Alison, for setting the stage with so important and so inspiring remarks. I think many points you highlighted. I'll touch upon in my presentation, or at least I hope that at least 2 or 3 of them will resonate with the audience. I'm Sven Harten. As Oscar said, I'm Deputy Director of the German Institute for Development Evaluation. And as you see on the next slide, DEVAL is a federal research institute in Germany. We're independent, and we have the mandate of evaluating Germany's bilateral development cooperation. And the reason why I put the picture here is because one thing that you need to know about our business model is this is where we are, right? We're very centralized. This is our office building. This is where 100% of our staff sits. So we're located in Bonn. And we're doing all our evaluation work, or let's say we're doing the large majority of our evaluation work our own. We rarely contract out, sometimes for local consultants on working on specific issues, bringing us specific local expertise. But our main business model is we do our evaluations for the German Ministry of Development Cooperation. We do it in-house. We do it in this building, and then we used to travel around the globe and work locally, sometimes with local consultants, gathering the data and bringing them back to that building and analyzing it there. So our aim there is really to provide scientifically robust evidence, working as a research institute, but at the interface between science, politics, and implementing organizations, and having very large, robust thematic or strategic evaluations. So this is what you need to remember. We're relatively young as well, and going to 130 staff this year roundabout. So this is how we work. Next slide, please. And what we do is we do the thematic evaluations, but we also work on developing methods and standards for evaluations, and we have a work stream on evaluation capacity development. So our business model, as you'll hear with the other presentations, is a bit different. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see, the pandemic really shook us. For us, it was an earthquake because imagine a travel ban. So how to conduct our evaluations. So for some evaluations, we were still fortunate that we just had gathered data. Actually, some colleagues came back with the last flights from Latin America, brought back the data, and we could work on them for some time. But you know, then the travel ban, a huge challenge for us. Also, you know, ensuring health safety. You know, we send all our staff into the home office. Our whole business model of working in small teams within the office, having a really collaborative atmosphere here. You know, we had to start from scratch, and also in comparison with multilateral agencies which have a decentralized structure and are very used to, you know, video conferencing, lots of telephone conferences, and so on and so forth. This was not how we operated. You know, we operated face to face in meeting rooms, spending lots of time in small workshops here. So on the organizational process, big changes to us. On the bottom, also you'll see evaluation topics. You know, also challenges. Obviously, suddenly in the public discourse in Germany, the whole topic of health emerged, and what is Germany doing in health in its development cooperation. This was a very niche subject in the last 5 to 7 years, and suddenly it re-emerged really strongly. So there were some changes with the evaluation topics, which I'll talk about in the new normal. But the main thing I want to focus here is on the evaluation process. So what we did in some evaluations, obviously we started to work with digital communication tools. So we worked stronger with local consultants and doing interviews via Zoom, Skype, and the other means. And actually, one of the lessons for, you know, perhaps not the most likely place was in Iraq, where we did a very big we're doing a big evaluation, is that conducting those interviews actually really worked quite well. And actually, one key takeaway here is also, you know, this virtual tool takes away a bit of the setting that you have. You know, sometimes if you go into a minister's office or a director's office, you know, the setting alone is used to sort of impress the evaluator and set a certain stage, you know. Or if you go to some other places, you know, the surroundings do have an impact on the atmosphere of the interview. So if you do it face to face, that's one thing. In Iraq, actually, it worked well because it was more an intimate atmosphere where you had the impression you were sitting sort of in somebody's house and could talk really privately. So actually, we got really good information from those virtual interviews. So next slide, please. So what did we do differently in terms of the methods that we use? I would like to highlight 3 things. So one is a stronger use of evaluation and evidence synthesis. So rather than you know, doing our data collection ourselves, as Alison said, you know, we used existing evidence. And first of all, we started to map what evidence is out there. So an evidence gap map. Based on the evidence gap map, we did then systematic reviews or an intervention heat map together, for instance, with the Green Climate Fund on climate change adaptation. Where does the money go? Does the money go where we have evidence, or does it go where we have gaps in evidence? So there's so much stuff out there that we discovered, well, we can spend a lot of time just working on finding the gaps in the evidence, doing systematic reviews in some areas, meta-analysis in others. So that's one key message for you right there. We have so much evidence that we can use. We don't have to go into the field all the time and try to reinvent the wheel and getting our own unique small data sets. Second, also mentioned by Alison, geospatial impact assessment, one on interventions in Mali using satellite data. We had some smaller projects in the past, but they were more like niche. So much stronger focus on that and working a bit on text mining. And then obviously trying to triangulate the data. You know, what do we get from the satellite pictures? How does that fit with the evidence from a systematic review, and then repackaging it? So I think there's some interesting tools out there that you'll hear from the colleagues as well. Next slide, please. So just to finish, this is already my last slide. So what does might the new normal perhaps look like? So one thing I alluded to in the beginning, at least here in Germany for bilateral cooperation, now there are some new thematic priorities emerging. Obviously, COVID-19, sure, but also around that, a stronger focus on resilience, vulnerability, then fragility, and the whole package of climate change, mitigation, adaptation, which is sort of the big crisis looming behind COVID-19. So more new thematic priorities that are coming up, and that we are getting sort of from our stakeholders presented, and saying, well, you need to focus on that in your work. Then in our evaluation designs and methods, I think one key lesson here is in the German community is we need to focus on data sharing. So the BMZ, our Ministry of Development Cooperation, kicked off a community of practice on data, on development cooperation, where we're working together with the ministry, with GIZ, with KfW to share data, because we realize, this is something that we can't do alone. We're all in the same boat. Also, as I said, a big topic on remote data collection, geodata, and last but certainly not least, greening our evaluations. So we want to ban travels or reduce travels to absolutely minimum below air travel, that is below 1,000 kilometers. That should be done by train or other means, not flights, but also, where in the past flight to Africa or wherever was the default, now the default should be virtual, and if necessary, you still fly out there. A really big point, what we found is that ECD, evaluation capacity development, is so key in light with the Agenda 2030, the SDGs, the big global evaluation initiative being led by the World Bank, IEG, and UNDP is a key thing to strengthen local capacities, to contribute to evidence-based policy making, and we want to contribute a little bit to supporting ECD in partner countries. So with that, perhaps one last point, which is quite nice, at least in Germany, this whole crisis meant that suddenly scientific voices became much more prominent than they were in the past. So we, as scientific experts in the field of development cooperation, we're quite delighted that at least in the public discourse in Germany, the word of experts on supplying demands for evidence-based decision-making has a bit more prominence than it had sometimes in the past, and we really want to use this to contribute a little bit so that Germany's development cooperation can be more effective in contributing to Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. So thank you.
Thank you, Sven, for such an engaging presentation. To me, it was refreshing to hear your take on some of the positives that have unexpectedly happened, and a great reminder for all of us that the interviews is not just about the person, but also about the situation. And I thought that resonated with a lot of us that have been doing this type of work. Before I turn to the next presentation, I just want to remind all of you that you will be asked to submit your questions to the panelists through the Poll Everywhere site. So you have the link there, pollev.com, IEG now. If you wish to add your first name and location, so we get a sense of where the question is coming from. That would be great, but you know, it's up to you. So now let me introduce you to the next speakers, which will tell us about USAID's experience. So we have Alison Hasselkorn, who's the acting evaluation team lead at the Office of Learning, Evaluation and Research, and also Sophia van der Wiel, who is a senior evaluation specialist. So over to you, Alison. They will both share the presentation. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Oscar, and thank you everyone for hosting us today. We're thrilled to be joining you. Again, I'm Alison Hasselkorn. I'm the acting evaluation team lead. I'm also the manager or COR for USAID's largest MEL mechanism, the Eval Me Too IDIQ, and I'm joined by Sophia. Is your mic working? Perhaps not. I'll give you a minute. So I'm joined by Sophia, who is also our COR for the agency's largest MERL mechanism for MEL innovation. So next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start off with an overview of how USAID approaches evaluation. Things that are helpful to know. As an agency, we perform approximately 200 evaluations per year, give or take. And we have a generally decentralized system. So this is completely different from our past presentation here today. This means that every operating unit, that's our missions internationally, as well as our bureaus here in headquarters, are responsible for planning, commissioning, and managing their own evaluations. And due to agency policy to mitigate the risk of conflict of interest, most of these evaluations end up being contracted out. So at the very least, there is an external evaluation team lead. We do have some evaluations that are performed internally by USAID staff. We also have some evaluation or agency-wide evaluations or studies that are run out of our office. And one of the ways that we support the agency around evaluation is through this Merlin mechanism that Sophia manages. Sophia, is your mic back on?
It is, and I hope it stays on. So again, I'm Sophia van der Wiel. I manage Merlin, which stands for Monitoring, Evaluation, Research, and Learning Innovations. And it has 4 agreements under it, which do various things. So one is called Spaces, another one is called Developmental Evaluation. There's also Rapid Feedback and ERIE, Expanding the Reach of Impact Evaluation, which looks at ex-post evaluations.
Yeah, and one thing that's important to know about Merlin is that it's, again, our biggest mechanism we have for testing out more innovative approaches across evaluation as well as other related fields. And it also is mostly, though not entirely, a cooperative agreement mechanism. So this issue of contracting and cooperative agreements ends up being really important in the USAID context, because when something like COVID happens, it creates operational problems as well as actual, design or implementation issues in the evaluations themselves. So a cooperative agreement is essentially a setup that's, more gives USAID operating units more say or more control than, a fully external evaluation, but less control than a contract, which is the typical setup in USAID. Next slide, please. Okay, and we again are out of the PPL LER office. That's USAID's leader in evaluation policy and practice. And our team has, what's that, Sophia?
Learning, evaluation, and research. Sorry, go ahead.
We have 4 main functions. So basically, we write and publish the agency policy, guidance, and tools on evaluation. We provide the technical assistance and capacity building across the agency to actually implement those policies and practices. We explore evaluation methods and approaches. So sometimes this is by running our own studies or evaluations, sometimes by supporting other operating units. Merlin would be an example here. And finally, but we help support the enabling environment for evaluation across USAID. And this includes advocacy to our internal leadership, to Congress, running agency-wide studies or evaluations that help us learn about evaluation trends, kind of a broad foundational piece. Next slide, please. So answering these main questions, we thought we'd take a bit of a different approach. We'll start by giving you an overview of evaluation trends in the agency based on those evaluations that we do see or manage or have surveyed, and then give you some specific examples from the Merlin mechanism. So to answer the first question around how we've, adapted under COVID, few key things. We've really needed to increase our flexibility, and again, the big piece first is around how we contract. So procurement. COVID interrupted many of our planning timelines, but most of our budget timelines were not as flexible. So there was a lot of pressure to be able to quickly move to procure evaluations that were needed in order to provide, information needed for decision making in our programs. And so there was a lot of interest in more flexible or rapid ways to procure evaluations. There's also been interest in flexible contract mechanisms, mechanisms that allow, for example, like phased contracts where you could go milestone based and be able to adapt as you go. The second major area of flexibility was around evaluation design itself. So we've had a pre-existing trend in the agency toward co-creation or co-design in evaluations between USAID, the evaluation partner, the implementing partner, the communities we're working with. And so we've seen what seems to be a bit of a supercharging there. So more of a push in that trend toward more of that, as well as, again, this interest in adaptive design of the evaluations that may be phased. And finally, flexibility and implementation, which gets to the next couple points. One major trend has been an increased contracting with local partners and local individuals. So because we were unable to staff, field staff internationally for so long, there's been an increased push toward local partnership, local capacity building, which was another pre-existing trend we've had in the agency, at least for the last 5 to 10 years. So we see that increasing. And we've seen some, adapting around how teams work together to enable more of the evaluation to be staffed by international employees. We've also seen a big push toward remote data collection. So much like Sven was saying, more remote data collection, whether it's by phone, by internet. Some aspects have been facilitated. Things that helped have been, it's relatively less expensive to do data collection this way, so we've been able to gather more data. Even though it comes also with challenges of being able to schedule sometimes, because due to a pandemic, everybody has been juggling a lot, and so finding the time to interview folks can be hard. I'll now turn it to Sophia to speak a little bit more about specific examples from Merlin.
Thank you. Now you can hear me. That's great. So the first mechanism I was going to quickly touch on is called SPACES. It's the strategic program to analyze complexity and evaluate systems. And this, I think, is particularly relevant because, as we know, nothing happens in isolation, and every development program is in a complex system. So I think the point of these 4 mechanisms is to test, right? To see how are these applicable in USAID? Are they better, quote unquote, than the typical ways USAID has of doing things? So this one in particular was meant to say, let's not ignore the fact that things are constantly changing. We can't, just assume like linear progress and things won't change along the way. We have to assume things will change along the way. And so this is one where they were able to produce reports for missions remotely. Another example comes from rapid feedback, which is another mechanism, trying to look more at quicker results along the way. Rather than waiting to the end of a program or something like that, they would really try to produce quicker results for learning and implementation and encourage more that seems to be working cheaper and faster. The last one is expanding the reach of impact evaluation, which is a lot more looking at completed evaluations and doing ex post analysis. And there they did one in Malawi for Food for Peace, where they found really good results at the end of the program. And then after a few years after, they weren't necessarily sustained. Over, back to Allison.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so as far as innovations, across evaluations, we've seen two major changes. One, again, is in remote monitoring and data collection. A whole host of actual technologies here, sometimes as simple as CADI or computer-assisted telephone interviewing being scaled up, anything virtual via computer-based platforms for focus group discussions or interviews, as well as geocoded survey data. The second area we've seen is more kind of innovation around how our teams work together, so collaboration, and this is both within the evaluation teams and how they collaborate with USAID, as well as how we collaborate during a focus group discussion or an interview, for example. So more use of things as simple as Google Drive to share data live and be able to organize and access them, to use platforms like that to allow interview respondents or focus group discussions to engage with data in real time. And I think I'll come back to this later. I know we're running short on time. Sophie, I'll let you speak to Merlin.
So I think basically a lot of the points on Merlin are it's much more remote, right? So a lot of the deliverables are produced remotely. A lot of the collaboration, data collection, etc., happens remotely. And even on the ex post stuff, they don't need necessarily to go into the country and collect more data. They can use existing data like GIS data, which has already been mentioned, which you can retroactively propose a comparison group. So over.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So new normal. We expect a lot of lasting changes here. One is budgetary. You know, as we have seen that we can get rigorous data and rigorous evaluations in this space, we get accustomed to the cost efficiency of being able to do so much remote data collection, for example, as well as being able to work locally with local evaluators. We also expect more interest in this adaptive procurement and design, remote collaboration, remote data collection, and this trend toward more local partnership we expect will be a major one. One team actually told us that the use of more local validators was the top thing that they expect to come out of COVID. COVID forced us to work with our local colleagues and mentor them more to help them deliver to USAID standards. And this is important because it means in the future we may not only kind of be going through primarily US-based organizations in order to work with local firms and local individuals, but it will increase our ability to work directly with them. And of course, as Sven mentioned, we expect that there will be more thematically more interest in evaluating the pandemic's effects on our programming itself. Sophia?
It looks like our time is up, but thank you.
Okay, that will be all then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison and Sophia. I felt that your efforts at doing more rapid feedback are very much aligned with the demand. One of the things that I can personally share is that I have felt that the demand for quicker and earlier evaluation results is skyrocketed since the pandemic began. Okay, so now let me turn over to Estelle Raimondo, who's a senior evaluator with us in the independent evaluation group, and she is also a member of the methods team in the in IG, in addition to being an evaluator, task team leader of numerous tasks. So she will be reflecting on 1 year of dealing with unknown unknowns. Over to you, Estelle.
Thank you, Oscar. So because my colleagues have already, I think, echoed many of the adaptations that we have undertaken at IG, I've decided to try to give you a little bit of a peek at what it actually looks like, all of these different types of methods and approaches that you have heard through. So let's move to the next slide. Before I get started, just a quick, overview of how embedded the independent evaluation group is in the larger World Bank Group evaluation system. We are independent, which means that we reports directly to the board, the executive board. We do not depend on management. However, we very much try to inform and influence management. We are centralized, like Deval. Most of us are based in HQ in Washington, DC, and we do conduct most of our evaluations in-house. We get support from local experts, technical experts, sometimes methodological experts, but we really tend to be an in-house kind of delivery model. We do validation work, which means validating the self-evaluations done by our operational team. That's a very important part of our work. A second very important part is carrying out pretty complex evaluations. They are multi-site, multi-interventions, multi-methods, mostly thematic or country program. And we, of course, have a major work on evaluation capacity development with the GEI that Sven mentioned, as well as other initiatives. So let's go to the next slide, and I will tell you a little bit about our journey. So on, I think it was April 10th, 2020, a few of us got together and tried to put a little bit of order in what would be the unforeseeable future and how we would try to muddle through those decisions points. It's not linear, it's quite messy, but it was shaped around 4 key questions. Should and how will we adapt our evaluation questions and scope and work program? How can we find ways around what is infeasible, the depth of the evidence that we get when we go on mission, the relationship we build on the ground, the spontaneity of meeting new people, that was no longer possible. So how do we find ways around that? Can we improve what remains feasible, and can we really get robust evidence from our building blocks, notably on the portfolio work? And finally, can we find alternative sources of evidence? Can we be pushed to really get out of our comfort zone? So these were the 4 framing questions, and I will use them to continue on our journey. Next slide, please. So how did we adapt to what we do? I think, these 3 main points were not new, but we really put them on the forefront. First, putting our users' needs really front and center. That meant listening to what were their information needs, being much more responsive in terms of the timeliness of what we delivered. We also became available to provide on-demand monitoring and evaluation support. We tried to mine the past knowledge and make it available and really usable. So in some way, we moved a little bit closer to our operational colleagues in that venture. The second was to be even more mindful of their absorptive capacity as they were delivering really fast on the COVID-19 response. That meant a premium on focusing our work. We tended to have really large and comprehensive evaluations. We tried to focus much more, thinking really hard about the format of how we would deliver that evidence. Alison mentioned the modular approach, which is something that we are trying, bite-size rather than these long evaluation reports. And finally, to make the most of a crisis in some way, we also engaged in that double loop learning, right? Questioning our fundamentals. And so we had an extensive review of our validation work. We did a meta-evaluation on our methodologies. And there was this movement, this groundswell of outcome orientation that Alison mentioned as well, which was really a soul searching on what is the role of evaluation to inform decision-making under uncertainty, and could we let go of some of our mechanisms of the past? Next slide. On the second question, can we find ways around what is infeasible? My colleagues already touched upon the importance of getting acquainted with remote everything, but also valuing better local expertise. So I will focus on 2 other aspects. Next slide, please, Sylvia, which is reshaping the reflexive evaluation team. I think this is our main instrument. You know, whatever the data, whatever the methodology, the evaluation team is key. And we were put to quite an extreme shock. So we had to learn to work differently together. And I think we shouldn't underestimate what that means in terms of our practice. And I think the test is still out there. So we will see if we kind of got better or different. We might have been more horizontal, more intimate, but also maybe less spontaneous. I don't know. I think this is something we need to reflect on. Next slide, please. Another kind of innovation and a way around was to try to observe from space when we could not observe from the ground. This is definitely not a substitute for in-depth qualitative work, but it was a way for us to really maybe get up to speed on geospatial data. This is just one example of trying to get better at understanding different variables of what we can do with geospatial analysis. In the example of Maputo, it was also an opportunity for us to, get reacquainted with more impact evaluation techniques that we had let go at some point in our history. And so you can see the attempt at having control groups, delineating a buffer zone. And so that was also an opportunity for us to retry more impact evaluation techniques. Next slide. On the third question, can you improve what remains feasible? I think there we really put a lot of emphasis on our portfolio work and getting faster, better, and carving more space to do other things as well. Next slide. That meant investing in kind of semi-automatic portfolio identification. That meant trying to really make the most of machine learning techniques. And along the way, I think we have become better at finding the right type of conceptual model. This is an example of the evaluation on undernutrition with a really solid conceptual framework that was the basis for supervised learning. I think we have also learned to recalibrate our expectations on what can be done with machine learning and what cannot be done. We have also gotten better at creating training sets. So I think we've learned a lot on the caveats and the potential. And the major takeaway is that we learned by doing. I think before this year, we had a lot of preemptive ideas, biases. We were concerned about a lot of things, but this year we just jumped into it and learned by doing. Next slide. We also leverage that, new tools, machine learning, AI, to answer that demand for faster products, faster synthesis, just-in-time nodes. This is an example of a rapid synthesis on the World Bank support to host and migrant communities, where we really the team tried to merge more traditional synthesis with AI. And I think we have now also learned about the process of doing that. So trying to share with other teams, the right pathways to do that. And that's the picture you can see on this slide. Next slide. On the final big question, can we tap into sources of evidence that were not on our radar screen before? I will just mention two quick examples of testing the water with alternative big data and with social media data. Next slide. So in this example, the team working on Bathor in Albania and neighborhood improvement tried to use web scraping evidence on real estate prices, which was something we hadn't done before, and also try to really be better at mixing that really rich 3,000 data points with ground truthing and having local experts to really also make sense of those maps, etc. The team also tried not only those satellite data, but actually streetscape analysis, which is those much more high resolution pictures that you can get when you go on Google Earth, and trying to find tools to also make the most of these so that we could not observe only from space, but also observe from the street without being there. Again, extremely important to have local expert and ground truthing there, but I think we have experimented and we need to learn those lessons. Next slide, please, Sylvia. Finally, what will the new normal look like? I'm really eager to hear the conversation. 4 takeaways from my perspective. I think the different ways of working together is probably something that, you know, we don't know again what it will be when we return to maybe a little bit of physical presence, but I think we need to reflect on that. The second is that, you know, data science is not going away. It's not a substitute, but it's also to this year, I think we gave ourselves license to try things out. And maybe in the future, we need to continue to be more sophisticated in how we bring together different data sources and be aware of the biases and the limitations of data science. I mentioned the, you know, movement around redefining the role of evaluation in time of uncertainty. I think this is something that will stay with us, and hopefully we've learned a lot this year. And finally, I think, you know, I've used the term globally because I do believe that maybe that's one of the areas where we haven't innovated as much, and we should continue to really think through how we value local expertise, how we build networks, how we change our division of labor, and maybe we change the default, which puts even more premium on ECD, I believe. Leaving you with those thoughts and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Estelle. Fascinating, as always. So I want to turn to participants, to everyone in the audience, and remind them that we will be taking questions. We already got a few questions, but we want more coming in. Actually, if you go into the poll everywhere, there's actually a question that was asked of you as well, which was in 1 or 2 words, as we emerge from COVID, what's your hope? I hope in evaluation we can do better at. And you know, whether you answer or not in the poll, I just want to leave that thought with you as you leave the session today. That, you know, what's your hope for doing better? So please keep the questions coming in. So far, we have a few of them, and I want to start one on something, Estelle, that you just mentioned. Maybe we'll go in reverse order of how the presentations were run. You were talking about being aware of the limitations of data science, and I think some in the audience have also expressed this concern about what sort of like digital bias are we introducing here. Some were referring to the tarmac bias that was referred to in the literature a couple of decades ago or so. So can you speak to that? How do you counter that? Are we ignoring you know, big chunks of the population that we are really trying to have an impact on in development? What are your thoughts, Stell?
I think there is a risk that we become enchanted with you know, the magnitude of the data, and you know, I heard Sven saying also you know, we can spend years just mining the data that's already out there. So there is a risk, but I also think that it shouldn't prevent us from actually getting into the experimentation, while and that's how we will learn how the limitation of what we can do. So just to give you one example, in the Bethor example that I showed you with web scraping, you know, price data, it was very clear that you know, the data set only covered certain areas of the neighborhood, and the area where the most vulnerable people, etc., there was of course no price data. It was much more informal, etc. So we could missing information there. And so that's where, you know, the presence of local expert, local consultants helped us, you know, not only bridge that data gap, so they actually went and tried to collect more information, but it also put in perspective that there was indeed a risk of really missing a lot. Same thing with the social media data. So it's about combining those, you know, more conventional sources, being really realistic about what we can cover, and also not giving up on the part that we cannot cover because we don't have the data. And I think that's really a question that we always need to have on our mind.
Thank you, Estelle. Alison, Sophia, you're next. Perhaps inevitably you get a question about local. So there were some comments, some questions about how local experts and evaluators are essential. And you know, could you speak more about the challenges that you may have faced on finding individual experts, firms? You were referring to the fact that you are trying to build that up. And so if you could speak to that. And somewhat related, if you could speak also to situations of insecurity, where, you know, how do you navigate that that aspect of the work related to, you know, to local experts, but also, you know, in terms of like any data gathering effort that you do on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. Yeah, this issue of working locally, hiring local firms, local experts, local enumerators, is a trend that has been important to USAID for quite a while now, and that we have several ways that we've been trying to increase this trend, or increase local contracting over time. One of them is actually through this IDIQ series that now I'm a manager of, but my office has been running iterations of this IDIQ for the last decade. Which is basically just a big mechanism through which any operating unit in our agency can procure evaluations. So one thing we've done, or one way we've tried to encourage this working with local experts, is to make it a requirement of that IDIQ. So right now, this IDIQ is so large that a lot of our evaluations end up being procured through it. And in order to provide those evaluation services, we required at the designing phase of the mechanism that all of our contractors who provide these evaluation services have plans in place, demonstrate that they do contract locally. So they had to demonstrate that this was something that was an inherent part of their business plan in responding to USAID evaluations in order to even get into this pool. So one way we've tried to go about over time increasing the number of evaluations that are working locally with local experts is to make it a requirement where we can of our own contracting mechanisms. This has been kind of a long-term plan, but we have seen that over 10 years of doing it so far, and now at the outset of this newest iteration, that it is increasing the numbers of local firms and local individuals who are being contracted or subcontracted into these evaluations. It is one kind of very top-down way of increasing that demand, which then increase the opportunity at our evaluation or contracted levels, at the evaluation levels, where we see, I think I mentioned it before, more mentoring of those local staff. There's a lot of training on USAID's idiosyncratic rules, regulations, standards, whatever it is, so that local experts are able to adapt very quickly and produce data or reporting that doesn't need a lot of extra kind of work on it. So over time, we see that it is helping to increase the number of local experts and firms that we're able to more directly contract with. And the hope is that that will continue over time and that this will just increase that. That said, it is still challenging sometimes. And I think, when you go back over time, and it hasn't always been easy for local experts to access USAID contracts or to even, be found or to kind of get into those contracts. That finding people, that creating these mentoring or capacity building activities has been one way we've been trying to encourage just that matchmaking, or even just, often the local expertise is the most valuable part of the evaluation. So just the training or the mentoring on just understanding what USAID wants or requires, you know, speaking the language of USAID, as it were, has been the biggest focus. And so that's maybe the short-term answer. So we've seen in a lot of evaluations over the last year, they said, you know, the first thing we tried was to go back to people we've worked with before, and we give them a quick training, like quick re-up on their training, and see if they can work with us again, see if they know other people. So this very rapid networking. And that's been one of the short-term solutions. And then, of course, we as an organization try to and could do more to do broader based capacity building in countries that we're working in, you know, encouraging workshops, or in the past we've supported, you know, regional M&E spaces, just to help kind of get the word out more that we are looking for more of this local partnership and providing some of those training opportunities. To answer quickly the question around insecurity, yeah, that is a real challenge and an ongoing challenge. You know, things we've tried in the past in what we call non-permissive environments or insecure environments relies a lot on things like third-party monitoring. It relies heavily on local people and expertise, a lot on remote data collection, GIS, you know, anything that can be done where we can't field staff. This does create additional challenges. Often, I think what things we do to try to mitigate issues are to increase the subcontractor level responsibilities for data quality assurance, more oversight from HQ. But of course, you know, that does not make it an easy issue. So this is something that we continue to work on and will continue to grapple with, I think, into the future. But as more of these remote data collection innovations are tested and tried out, it may open up new things to try.
Thank you. So we got a lot of questions on data, perhaps also predictably, both quantitative and qualitative. And I'll turn to those in a second. But there was also a very interesting question that I'm going to ask Sven to have a go at, which is related to, you know, you are all in large organizations, but what can smaller organizations do? What, you know, from your perspective, what are the things that you guys have tried that actually you think may translate across size?
Yes, thank you, Oscar. So, I mean, we are, as you know, as the colleagues here present, you know, Evaluation and Research Institute. So one source of inspiration is obviously, you know, journal articles in the literature, and sometimes you see methodological innovations being present there. But what I find even more inspiring is when you go to the evaluation conferences, you know, the AEA, the EES, AFREA, the Asian Evaluation Week. Oftentimes you have, for instance, poster sessions where small companies present their innovative products there. And so if you're a small organization and if you have an innovative product, I think this is a space where you find an audience that is interested and, you know, at those conferences looking for innovation. So I would recommend that you at least you know, try to get a poster session there and present your innovations to that interested audience. I think that's you know, Max QDA, for instance, which is now like so common place. You know, a couple of years back, they when they were still smaller, you know, they went to all possible conferences and had their poster sessions and presented their product there, or some geospatial tools are being presented, and they've been growing a lot. So if I were a small entrepreneur, I would do this, because there you would meet people from the World Bank, from the UN organizations, you know, possible clients, future clients.
Thank you, Sven. Since I have you there, I'm going to go another round. This time I'll go in the order that you spoke in your presentation. So, Sven, you spoke a little bit about how interviews actually have some unexpected positives in the way, but there are some questions about, is the range of qualitative evidence that we can gather somehow reduced? Someone was like asking pointedly, how can you do focus groups remotely? You can't possibly do that. So what's your sense as to the qualitative data collection, how it has changed in your evaluations?
Yeah, right. I mean, those are great questions from the audience, and I think Estelle and Alison, they made the most important points here. I mean, this there's no silver bullet. There's no miraculous solution now to do everything virtual. We have some new innovative virtual tools that we can use, but none of that is going to replace for 100% the tools and techniques that we as evaluators or as researchers have been using in the past 50 or some 100 years if you go back to the early anthropologists doing participant observation. So I hope that in the future, and I'm optimistic enough that there's still going to be possible to do travels and where we can work closely with local experts to collect qualitative and quantitative data. So having said that, no silver bullet. In our experience, using I don't want to have some promotions here, but there's some virtual tools, concept boards and stuff that you can use where you can bring groups together to do almost a focus group like workshop online. So for me, the technology is not an issue for the qualitative data collection. For me and for us in our work, the key problem was how to get your people to take part in those focus group discussions. How to select them. So to be honest, in the past year or year and a half, we've been fortunate enough that those evaluations where we needed to collect data and where we wanted to do focus group discussions or theory of change workshops, they were focusing on either urban folks or decision makers, right? So we had access to them, I must say, honestly. So we didn't have an evaluation taking place with data collection, gathering sort of data on remote, questions related to poverty or education and so on, where it would have been much more difficult. So our access was urban folks. Some issues there around infrastructure or others, related to policy making. So there we had access sometimes through snowballing to decision makers, and we did more rounds than you would have probably done in the country virtually, so that to get more people. But yeah, so we didn't have that challenge there, and now going forward, we do have one on climate change adaptation in Mali, where we're starting with a geospatial impact assessment using satellite data, and hopefully once that analysis is done, we'll have the opportunity to do ground truthing together with local colleagues in Mali. Yeah, there's just not one virtual tool that solves your issue. But I also wanted to make the point that bias has been a challenge for us always. And you had challenges also with statistical significance when you do surveys. So I think now we're coming at it from a different different angle in a way, but we have now more tools at our hand that we pilot tested. We jumped in the cold water, as Estelle said. We tried it out, took a bit more risk, and I think, you know, when we look back in 2 years, I think we'll find that, you know, the stuff that we tried out now will in the long term have helped us to improve a lot on the qualitative data collection, but it's not a single solution. So I'll keep it at that.
Thank you. I think those themes resonate, you know, very much. It's about adding to the toolkit, not about throwing away your pre-existing one, even if it is mothballed for the time being. And I actually think that the question, the way it was phrased by James, was very smart, because he was referring to this digital bias, but also talking about the tarmac bias. So it's not that we did not have biases before. So it's just that you get used to the ones when you apply a particular methodology over and over, but it's not that they don't have some sort of a bias. Let me move to USAID. It's a question for Sophia. And it's about the importance of remote collaboration in Merlin, and which was one of the things that you mentioned. So the question is, how do you plan on promoting this? What are the strategies that would allow team members engaged on learning and contributing to this? So more broadly, I guess you could also think of, you referred to co-creation, Alison, in your presentation. And I was, I guess, curious as to whether is co-creation more difficult or easier in the current environment? Is this something that requires a pre-existing condition, requires a pre-existing relationship to do co-creation? Or so I was curious to hear about like situations where you had to start from scratch as opposed to continue from the past. A lot of what we have been discussing today are things like, I think Sven mentioned, oh, we had some data, it was on the plane back, so we were able to. So it's sort of like, it strikes me that maybe, it's 15 months in, but we still have a legacy sort of like of previous. So I was curious to hear from Sophia maybe on not only the importance of remote collaboration, how do you want to promote it, but if you have like experiences of setting things up from scratch in the current situation.
Thank you, Oscar. So I guess I would say, by design, Merlin is meant to be testing things, right? So we are kind of trying to create things from scratch and not take existing tools and apply them somewhere new. So that's what I find exciting, right? We're not saying, oh, let's impact evaluation here or there. Let's do performance evaluation. It's really meant to see new ways of doing things. And so to us, we call this co-creation in the beginning because we invited so many different participants from so many different sources, universities, think tanks, consulting firms, to help us figure out what good ideas were in the space of monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. And so there, I think, for us, co-creation really meant having us at USAID be part of the team, not us telling the consultants, this is what you do and we'll pay you. It's really us saying, we will facilitate relationships with people in the agency, whether it's a mission, whether it's an operating unit in DC, and try to see if there's a match, right? Because we don't want to force things down people's throats if they don't want to try them, but we do want them to want to try them. And that's some of how I would say we promote this work. And I don't know if there's a good answer for USAID in general, because I do think part of our challenge is to get people to take more risks, right? They think, oh, we have to do things one way or another way because that's what the requirements say. And we're trying to say, you don't have to. Like, if you're willing to try this, great, and then we will try with you and learn from it. And so I think that's what I would say on that question. Over.
I might just quickly add to that as well that our office also oversees our policy for collaborating, learning, and adapting, which is both kind of organizational development, but also principles around learning that seeks to integrate collaboration throughout our planning, implementation, and use of data, of evaluation, of monitoring. These are all kind of interconnected. So it's another way where we try to integrate principles around collaboration throughout our program cycle. So that's maybe the closest thing we have to an USAID level promotion for collaboration for things like co-creation or co-design. And we see it in evaluation in areas like Sophia's work with Merlin.
And any thoughts on this idea as to whether, it's been more difficult to begin things as opposed to continue things from the past, or any reflections on that?
I think you can guess what the answer might be. Okay, I think it's a lot harder to do things from scratch. It's harder to get people to understand what USAID is and how it works. Get people to understand the nuances, right? There's a lot of strange things in USAID, including reporting and content of stuff. And so I just feel like that is a learning curve for any new partner. And so that is something I found surprisingly time consuming, still like 5 years into these Merlin mechanisms, to get them to understand how special we are.
Yeah, it is challenging. And to go back to, most of our evaluations are contracts. So as Sophia was saying, they are historically have been more of the type where, USAID comes up with a statement of work, we tell the contractor this is how we want you to do it, and then we manage it. Over time, we've been trying to move toward a more adaptive and collaborative approaches here, where the USAID is to be integrated into the evaluation enough to really work with a contracted team to make sure the questions are really going to get us the information we need when we need it, that the data collection methods and analyses are appropriate, that resulting recommendations are developed collaboratively, for example. But it is hard. It is hard, maybe even especially through a contracting mechanism, to when we are asking the contractor essentially to take on the risk of a contract, but to be dependent on us to have our act together enough to allow the staff time and resources to actually sit with them through all of this thinking and creation. There's a learning curve there. So it is always easier when our staff have at least done it before for us to do it again. There is a learning curve with how to do kind of more flexible or less defined evaluations through contracted mechanisms.
Thanks, and thanks for putting up with my persistence. Sven, I had mentioned earlier that we had a lot of questions on data. So I want to go back to preserve the market share of the questions. I think we need to go back to data. And the question is directly to you on, from your experience, how do you ensure data integrity and quality that is collected online? What sort of data validation do you have in place?
Yes, thank you. So I presume this is about virtual data collection, qualitative data, interviews, focus group discussions, or perhaps surveys. So there, just as in general, I mean, one is the standards statistical checks that you would do when you do surveys, and also looking at missing data. Sometimes you can work with imputation and stuff like that. So I think there, at least with some survey data, it's been the means been different, doing online surveys, but the tools to check on data quality and consistency of data are relatively similar, and sometimes you look also at the response rates. For instance, in some case, I remember that a team found that there was a large share of online survey responses that were done in an extremely short amount of time, which we wondered, because also the answers were relatively similar. We found out. So some checks are standard, and And in addition to that, for us, as I said before, doing online interviews and focus group discussions, the main challenge was really how to get the right people for the interviews, and to make sure that you didn't get a huge amount of bias. And to be honest, I do think that there was some bias. You can't just avoid that. I mean, most people taking place were digital literate, right? Some had to be sort of trained a bit to take part of that, but our audience were, or the people responding were urban folks, and sort of they were sort of representative for a certain urban group, but certainly not representative for the entire urban population. So I think for the questions that we wanted to answer, that was kind of okay. But generally, I think so to put it in a nutshell, I think for surveys, tools are similar than the ones we used in the past when we did paper and pen surveys, and for some other virtual tools, focus group discussions and so on, it was not so much what's been said during or the data collected during the interviews or focus group discussions, but more what came in there. So perhaps I'll leave it at that. Oh, and then of course, sorry, forgot the most important point. Triangulation, right? I mean, that's also standard. It's nothing new now with the pandemic. I mean, that you triangulate different data sources. So I talked already too long, but the last point is really the most important. My key takeaway is the checks for data quality and integrity that we have are quite thorough, and we could apply the same just to new techniques of collecting the data, I would say.
Thank you, Sven. We're starting to wind down the event. We want to definitely close on time, and I want to remind the participants that actually there is a resources section on the website for this event, and we will make sure to update that as well with additional documents, maybe from the conversation that we are having that are relevant. On the same theme, I wanted to actually ask Alison on this issue of from USAID, on any lessons or recommendations on the safeguarding and ethical use of data. I know you guys have been working on this.
Yes, thank you. We have a data branch of the agency as well that is charged with providing policy and best practices around protection of human subjects, the collection, storage, and use of data, and are updating many of their policies now. I believe we will be adding a recent report that they developed to the resources section that Oscar just mentioned. But just to give a quick overview of it, there are three main areas of what we think of as using data responsibly. The first is making sure that the data we collect is actually going to be used. That we're not collecting data that is basically just a burden, is not going to be used. If it's not going to be used in good faith effort to improve our programming, then we should not be collecting it. So a lot of that is around planning for data that can be used to help serve back with the communities we are working with. The second major lesson or principle is around privacy and security, and so this may be what the speaker or the question was getting to. But there are many considerations over the life cycle of the collection and use of storage and use of data, where planning for how to collect it responsibly and secure it safely need to be both planned for and then enacted based upon the context in which you are. So, everything, taking the principles of trying to remove or reduce the risk of capturing or keeping personally identifiable information is a major a major point there. Things like thinking about if you're collecting geocoded data, if it's going to be connected with any other information, any names, telephone numbers, even location and time. Once you start putting many sources of data together, it becomes easier for somebody to identify someone you may have collected data from. So things like thinking very carefully through what are all the data sources that I will be collecting for this project, for this evaluation. How could they be used to identify people? A lot of that thinking has to be done. It can't be automated. It has to be done project by project. The agency does have guidelines around that. There are also, country-based ethics we have to follow, and that gets a little bit to our last aspect, which is transparency and accountability. But that we are working with every country's rules and regulations around the collection of data, around IRB, around human subjects, that we are not just applying our own. So all of these things have to be thought of for every evaluation we do or every data collection activity. And as well, this final kind of transparency and accountability piece also speaks to USAID is required. We have a data development library. We are required to post all of our all data collected under USAID programming there, as long as it is qualitative, is not a security risk. There's some caveats there, but it has to be scrubbed for PII and it has to be made publicly available. Because as a government agency, we see that as a US taxpayer good, but it is open publicly to everyone. So again, makes that issue around PII way more important too, because it's all going eventually supposed to be getting out there on a public database.
Thank you. Great. So I want to apologize to those of you who have submitted questions and we have not been able to ask them. There were a lot. I'll note, for example, there's a lot of interest, Sven, on your guidance on what requires a flight or not. You spoke already on this, but maybe the material that we can make available in the website can also speak to that. There were questions about Twitter and the use of social media in general. Some skepticism on that regard. Maybe the material also will help address some of those concerns. I did want to, with a couple of minutes that we have left, ask one last question to Estelle. It's a question from Nepal that asks, how do we get to decision makers and policymakers in a timely fashion during such a fast-paced and changing environment? I know this is something that you're facing on a day-to-day basis. So if you can speak to that, or any final takeaways from your end, and with that we will bring to a close.
Thank you, Oscar. Yeah, I think there are two trends. There is the absorptive capacity of the decision makers. We shouldn't assume that all they have to hear is our very important and precious evidence, especially at this time. And at the same time, we want to be there if the need really is there in terms of mining the evaluation evidence that we have, because under uncertainty, you really want to use the trove of data. So I think it's really about also positioning ourselves to be there at the right time, having that connection, and that's really that line of communication, and repositioning a little bit the evaluator as the critical friend or the advisor that can be there on time. So it's all about the identity of the evaluator. I think my last parting thought will be that I think if we have one takeaway is to reconsider the flyby evaluation kind of thing, because we were all maybe also a bit guilty of that in the past. And so rethinking what needs a flight, but also, what needs longer, what needs better local evidence, what doesn't need us to be there, and kind of switching the default again, and not having this kind of model will be really important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Estelle. That's great. As we come to a close, I want to thank all the participants. I want to thank all the audience. I want to thank everyone that was involved behind the scenes to make this happen. It takes a village, and I want to leave you with an ask. I want to ask you to think about that question that we had put on the poll everywhere. As we emerge from COVID, I hope in evaluation we can do better at, and complete that that sentence. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.